That was a real treat for me. I don't know how you guys felt about it, but 40 years later, it still feels absolutely shocking, for me anyway. 72, arrived at Manchester Polytechnic after, again, coincidentally, a bit of a bizarre 3 months studying civil engineering. So again, there's a kind of technical connection there. And my A-levels were maths and physics and so on. So 3 months at Hatfield Poly turned out to be a complete disaster, and I realized, fortunately, very quickly. And then I went to work in a steelworks just north of Swansea in a place called Pontarddulais, while I waited for the new academic year to start, and I got into Manchester. When I arrived in 72, Martin Parr was in the 3rd year, and that's how I got to know him. And it was a very kind of dynamic and actually quite bizarre situation. For example, the head of photography, I don't know whether there's any kind of a parallel here, used to bring in his 2 pet lion cubs on leads. They were really quite small and they were very cute. But I guess later on they got bigger. But that gives you a little flavor of just how wacky the whole situation was. And what it meant was, given that the economic climate was quite benign, what often happens is liberality and a liberal attitude go hand in hand with that. So during the 3 years at Manchester, we were pretty much allowed to kind of do what we wanted to do. I decided to travel a lot, all over the country, and took landscape photographs. And in my 3rd year, or in between, I think it was actually just into my 3rd year, like just after the Christmas, I decided to go to Africa, and I wanted like a bigger landscape challenge. And I thought the Sahara Desert would give me a bit more drama, and I was right. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, because something quite amazing happened. So, left college, moved to Holland, lived in Holland for about 3 or 4 years, and saved up enough money to come back to buy a house for cash in West Yorkshire, because my wife at the time and we didn't want a mortgage. So we bought a house in Hebden Bridge, and I started to try to photograph again. I hadn't been working since 76 when I left college. We came back in actually 79. I spent 2 years trying to find my feet. And so altogether, it took 5 years after graduating before I was able to actually start making pictures again. All those years in Holland, I was going to see shows of painting, sculpture, and when I could, but it was very rare, photography. So in 81, sadly, that first marriage broke up, and I moved back into Manchester, and I began to make pictures. And I'm going to show you some of the photographs which I began to make in Manchester. Or at least while I was in Manchester. One of the things, of course, that when you live in the everyday world and you've got bills to pay and you've got to earn a living and stuff, is that very often it's a little bit difficult to concentrate on exactly what you want to do creatively. And this was one of the first projects I worked on, and it was obviously a very simple idea, 12-day journey. I took 12 days out of my normal routine, and I just said to myself, I'm just going to travel. I'm going to start down at Land's End. I don't know where I'm going to go. And I'm just going to take pictures round the clock without any interference, without any distraction, which is what I did. And these are some of the pictures which came from that. They look a little bit, Paul, these look a little bit harsher than when I saw them on my computer screen. So, folks, will you forgive the digital transformation here? This is a German tourist who was a youth hostel. He was sleeping above me, and he was very restless. And as a consequence, I was quite restless. Reach for the camera. One of the things I'm not going to do during this whole talk is actually explain pictures. What I am going to do is to give you a lot of background information around how the pictures came into the world, maybe. But I will go so far as to say, for example, here, that the fact that some of the cups are pointing in a different direction, for me, was a bit of a gift. as I've got older, I think maybe it's kind of interesting for younger photographers if I just talk a little bit about technical stuff. Would that be interesting for people, yeah? At this time, I'm shooting with a camera that had only come out in '82 or something, and quite a few of my contemporaries, people like Paul Graham and Martin Parr and so on, and possibly Paul, I can't remember, jumped on this camera. It was called a Plauber Machina. And it was it was basically like a giant Leica, but with a lens that concertinaed into the body. And it had a Nikon lens, even though the camera body was made in Germany, and this lens was absolutely incredible. So in a very, very compact package, I mean, the camera would fit like a paperback book in this side pocket. You didn't need a tripod. You could photograph, if you used 400 ASA, 2.8 lens, in lots of, many, many situations. So it was basically a kind of revelation. And I suppose a revelation in a way that might parallel, say, how Cartier-Bresson found photographing with a Leica when there hadn't been a small handheld 35mm camera prior to that. I'm sure other people in the room at the moment have had the experience of you're on a walk through the countryside, there's a field full of animals, and at a certain moment, one of those animals looks up and looks at you, and you're looking at the animal. Now, I don't know how to talk about that in a professional, technical way, but I do know that there's something for me that's very, very interesting that's happening at that moment. As you can see, in 1985, I was one of a number of photographers who were commissioned by the Photo Gallery in Cardiff to go into the Welsh valleys and make work. And they'd been commissioning, I can't remember when they began this series of commissions. It might have been a couple of years earlier. But I was obviously one of the people in 1985, having been born in Cardiff and gone to school in the Rhondda Valley in Tonnereval. It felt to me like a great opportunity. But we're talking about a time when Thatcher was very effectively dismantling the closing down coal mines effectively. And one of the really shocking things for me in the Rhondda Valley was to see how many, like during the afternoon, midday, mid-afternoon, how many guys of working age, let's say, 18 to 40 or whatever, in mining terms, 45, were just hanging around on street corners. And I really had, over a few visits, this very, very strong sense of a valuable resource running to ground and going to waste. And some people have suggested that these pictures are amongst my most political. I don't know whether you can make out the words on that piece of paper. It says holy matrimony. When I think back to this situation in which I made this picture, I realized just how much life has changed in this country, because this was in one of the valleys. I think it could well have been the Rhondda Valley. Might have been at a place called Kevin Coyd, where there was a huge coal mining area and a lot of railway sidings with wagons. But in those days, you could just walk, you could park your car and you could just walk straight off the sidewalk of the road onto the territory. There weren't guards, there wasn't razor wire, there wasn't searchlights, and of course CCTV cameras. And that's something I really do regret about what's changed in this country. But I guess it's obvious why it had to, maybe.